All right, that is a little jingle put together by the artist Sufjan Stevens. It's entitled Adlai Stevenson, and it is about the protagonist of my story, Adlai Stevenson II. My research is about Adlai Stevenson during the Cuban Missile Crisis. A little backstory about Adlai Stevenson II. He comes from a tradition of politics. His grandfather was vice president to Grover Cleveland and ran again as vice president to William Jennings Bryan. He was unsuccessful the second time. This was about the late 1800s. The grandson of the vice president is Adlai Stevenson II, the character I'm talking about. He was Illinois governor for a spell, and then he was the Democratic presidential candidate twice, in 1952 and in 1956. He ran against Eisenhower both times and was unsuccessful both times, but he put up a good fight. In 1960, after Kennedy was elected, he was appointed ambassador to the United Nations, and that is where he is for most of the story I'm about to tell. The Cuban Missile Crisis is the event that Adlai Stevenson is participating in, and it sort of began in 1962 when Adlai had been in the United Nations for 2 years. It was in response to missiles being found in Cuba by America. The missiles were placed there by the Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, who was worried about American meddling in Cuban affairs. He probably had good reason to be concerned because actions like the Bay of Pigs and Operation Mongoose had been going on to have American influence in Cuba. On October 14th, American U-2 planes found evidence of Soviet buildup of missiles in Cuba. They snapped pictures, and thus began the Cuban Missile Crisis as we know it. The Americans, these are some of the missile sites as seen by the U-2 and just where they were on the Cuban mainland. The main characters in the United States administration who would have to respond to the scary sight of missiles being built up in Cuba was ExComm, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. This is them. Adlai Stevenson was one of them, though he was a semi-permanent member. He wasn't there all the time. The permanent members were the Vice President Lyndon Johnson, RFK, the President's brother and Attorney General, Dean Rusk, the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, the Director of CIA, Joint Chiefs of Staff, and General Max Taylor. They were mostly split into two camps, Hawks and Doves. The Hawks were people who wanted a military action. Doves were people who wanted negotiation in response. The first ExComm meeting was without Adlai Stevenson, and it was mostly discussion based on military action. So the Hawks were leading the charge. They recommended a couple solutions. One was an airstrike to destroy any of the missile sites. The next was an invasion to wipe out the missile sites and maybe even depose Castro. There was also talk of airstrikes and an invasion. And the third option was a blockade to not let any more Soviet ships come into Cuba with more missile equipment. In the second ExComm meeting, Stevenson was there. He didn't say much, but listened and was concerned about what he heard about the military involvement. And so following the meeting, the second meeting that Stevenson was at, he wrote a letter to President Kennedy. He advocated a peaceful solution. He expressed a desire for communication between the United States and USSR. He also, in this letter, did something unique that none of the other ExComm members had done. He equated the United States missiles in Turkey and Italy to the ones the USSR had in Cuba, saying that if we have a right to have missiles so close to them, then they feel that they have a right to missiles so close to us. And he said that if we want them to dismantle their missiles in Cuba, we should be willing to dismantle ours in Turkey and Italy, which was a very controversial and very unique outlook from Adlai Stevenson. He ended the letter with a famous quote, "Blackmail and intimidation never, negotiation and sanity always." So he was very passionate about his desire to have this peacefully and diplomatically settled. the next couple days of XCOM were more conversation between the Hawks and the Doves. People like General Max Taylor and Robert McNamara represented the Hawks, and people like Llewellyn Thompson represented the Doves. There ended up being a lean towards a blockade, and then Stevenson wrote another memo in response to what he had heard to President Kennedy again. He again advocated for the crisis being put on the world stage in front of the United Nations, which was his territory. And he said if the crisis did go before the United Nations, he would be very stern with the Russians, emphasizing that it was their fault for this threat to world peace and their fault for potentially the world ending in a nuclear holocaust. He also, in this memo, did something completely unique and offered another bargaining chip to President Kennedy. He had already equated the missiles, American missiles in Turkey and Italy, to the missiles in Cuba, but said if Khrushchev is worried so much about American meddling, another bargaining chip could be the United States pulling out of Guantanamo Bay. That would Guantanamo Bay was an American site on the Cuban mainland, and so Stevenson will back out of Guantanamo Bay, and you dismantle the missiles. None of these ideas were favored by President Kennedy. In the National Security Council meetings that followed, the Hawks versus Doves really clashed. We saw many arguments for completely wiping out the missiles and the necessity to show American strength and be very stern and militaristic with the communists. And we also saw people advocating for a blockade like RFK. Stevenson spoke up during these meetings and said he was flatly opposed to any militaristic solution, thought that that was not the way to go about this. And he was unique in this. People rejected his idea of no airstrike. Kennedy himself was not in favor of Stevenson's ideas. So Stevenson during XCOM was unique in his arguments for how to solve the crisis. He recommended it should be negotiation and diplomacy that saved the day and not the favored militaristic airstrikes or invasions. Following these National Security Council meetings, a blockade was set up on October 22nd. This put the crisis in sort of limbo. And then Adlai Stevenson did get his chance in the United Nations to execute his plans for a negotiation and peaceful settlement on October 23rd, a day after the blockade was set up. Before this, in general, Stevenson was seen as soft on communism. It was one of the reasons why he didn't beat Ike. And so this was a chance for him to really show that he was a good American diplomat and he could be stern with the Russians. And he was in the UN. He put all blame on Soviets, said it was your fault. He also said that there should be a plan for independent UN commission to oversee dismantling of missile sites in Cuba and potentially Italy and Turkey, if that was the route we wanted to go, with a trade for dismantling both of them. October 25th, there was another UN meeting. The crisis was still not resolved, and it is one of the most electric UN meetings of all time. It's a legendary interaction. The Russian ambassador, USSR ambassador to the United Nations, was a guy named Zorin, and he spoke up and said that this threat to world peace was completely on the United States. It is their fault that we are all here in the United Nations discussing a potential nuclear war. Here's Adlai Stevenson at the UN. Stevenson rejected that claim and said it would be the first time he heard that the crime was not the burglary, but the discovery of the burglar. And he said that the fact that the Soviets did this missile buildup in such stealth and so quick proved that it is an offensive maneuver and that the Soviets should be blamed for this threat to world peace. Then the Russian ambassador Zorin said that you have no proof of us building up missiles there. This is all U.S. made up to get people to dislike the Soviet Union. Stevenson took issue with that. He said that, or he asked the ambassador point blank, do you deny the Soviet Union building up missiles in Cuba? The Soviet ambassador was speechless. He could not react. And Stevenson said, "Well, I'm prepared to wait," this is his quote, "until hell freezes over to hear your answer." It's a very famous interaction in the Soviet Union. And then he got up and proved, he set up easels of pictures of the Soviet Union building up missiles in Cuba. He got the world aware of Soviet escalation and got world opinion on the side of the United States against the Soviet Union. And 3 days later, after Stevenson's speech, the Hell Freezes Over speech in the United Nations, the crisis was over. The missiles were taken down, the blockade was ended, and world peace was secured. Adlai Stevenson was imperative to the world peace being secured in the Cuban Missile Crisis. He was a dove. He argued for diplomacy and negotiation and not military involvement. In XCOM, he was unique and passionate for this argument. Without Stevenson in XCOM, I think that an airstrike or an invasion of Cuba was very likely, and the world may not exist anymore. Once he got into the UN and got a chance to execute his plans, he was very aggressive. He was stern with the Russians, blamed the USSR for threatening world peace, got world opinion on the side of the United States. He also denied that there was an absence of proof, and then proved to the United Nations what the U.S. was saying, that the USSR was escalating things. So he was very important to the world maintaining its existence and avoiding nuclear holocaust. Because of his unique argument and unique execution, he facilitated a peaceful conclusion to the crisis. Uh, Thank you very much for listening. I hope you all understand how important Adlai Stevenson was and grow to love him as much as I have during my research. Thank you.